Good evening. It's Mr. Evans again with another book this evening. Tonight our book is called The Trouble with Terry. Again, it is a kind of long book, so feel free to stop at the chapters and save another portion for another day if you wish. The Trouble with Terry was written by Joan Lenau and it was published in 1962. Chapter 1 is called F is for Finally. No more pencils, no more books, no more teachers' dirty looks. All the children but one were chanting it as they leaped, ran, and danced out of the school building. It was Friday noon and the start of summer vacation. 1 second they were still in school, the next one more step and they were free, or would be when they crossed the street. The police boys were having trouble making the lines reform on the sidewalk. Finally they were ready, and, still chanting, they shuffled off to the corner. The only quiet one was Teresa Seth, 10 years old, with an F in arithmetic on her report card. Terry kept in step with her 5th grade class, her books, pencil box, ruler, and notebooks in her arms, and stared unseeing at the feet of the girl ahead of her. At last they were at the corner and crossing the street. Each one, on reaching the opposite curb, gave a glad whoop and raced down the sidewalk. When Terry reached the other side, she went on walking as before. Her classmates were soon ahead of her. "Terry, come on, hurry up!" Cindy Ford yelled back at her. She waited for Terry to catch up. Terry and Cindy had been best friends even though they lived 2.5 blocks apart. Then another girl, Kimberly Schaefer, had moved in a couple of houses away from Cindy, and the two played together all the time. Whenever Terry came along, they were always in the middle of something. They seemed glad to see her, but still she felt left over. She seldom went to play with Cindy now. Kim said, "Gee, Terry, you look like it's the end of the world, doesn't she, Cindy?" "I saw the F on your report card," Cindy said. "I couldn't help it. I don't know why they have to write them in red anyhow." "You shouldn't feel so bad about it," Kim said. "I've had a couple of F's in spelling. My folks hardly even rant and rave about it anymore." She stopped, seeing by Terry's expression that this was the wrong thing to say. Terry didn't know how she was going to tell her mother. Her mother often said, "One thing I don't have to worry about. My children get good marks in school. Not that they couldn't do still better," she'd add, looking at Terry. Her brother Tommy couldn't do much better if he tried. He was 1.5 years older than Terry and about 5 years brainier, she thought bitterly. "If I'd only had some idea," she said. "Mrs. Selby said when she held me back at recess that she'd tried to warn me." The girls were walking down the block, pausing now and then to get a better grip on their books. "Anyhow," Terry said, kicking at a stone, "Mrs. Selby may be nice, but she doesn't mark fair." "What do you mean?" Kim said, surprised. "I thought she was fair." "Lots of times she isn't," Terry insisted. "Like the time it said in a test that somebody spent 25 cents one day and 75 cents the next day and 50 cents the day after. And just because she'd been telling us about averages, she wanted us to say that it was the same as spending 50 cents each day. But you can't buy something for 75 cents if you only spend 50 cents. So I said it was the same as spending what was spent, and she marked it wrong." "Gee, I never thought about that," Kim said. "Did you talk to Mrs. Selby about it?" Cindy wanted to know. "What good would it do?" Terry said. "I talked to her the time she asked what kind of lines didn't meet, and she wouldn't change my mark." "What kind of lines did you say?" Cindy asked. "I said faraway lines. And Mrs. Selby said it should have been parallel lines. But remember when she said railroad tracks were parallel lines? And railroad tracks meet. You look at any picture of railroad tracks and you'll see. Mrs. Selby said they only seemed to meet, and if you walked up to where you saw them meet, you'd see that they didn't. But they do meet from where you're standing in the first place. I tried to tell her, but she wouldn't listen. Terry was almost in tears at the injustice of it. You'd think she'd have marked you half right anyhow, Kim said. Terry took a deep breath to keep from crying and went on. And I talked to her about the multiplication tables, too. I asked her why we had to remember them when we could write them down in a notebook and look them up when we needed them. She asked if I wanted to carry a notebook around the rest of my life, and I said I wouldn't really mind. I really wouldn't, but she wouldn't let me do it that way. I think teachers are like parents, Kim said. They listen to you, but they never agree with you, even when you're right. They had reached Kim's house. She went in to eat, calling over her shoulder, "See you in a little while, Cindy. You too, Terry. You come back and play." "Why don't you stay and have lunch with me, Terry?" Cindy said. "You could ride my bike." The only fight they'd had when they were best friends had been over Cindy's bike. The day Cindy got it, she had taught Terry how to ride it. For Terry, it was like being in heaven. After that, every time she came to Cindy's house, her first words had been, "Can I ride your bike?" Until one day Cindy exploded, "Do you come to see me or my bike?" Now all Terry said was, "I want to get this junk home." She didn't feel much like playing or even bike riding. She walked slowly home. At the end of Cindy's street, the houses stopped. From there on, down a block and over a block, all was woods. On the corner after the woods was Terry's apartment house. One day Terry had overheard somebody walking by say that it looked like a cracker box. She'd burned at the tone of it, but she had to admit that the building did look like a huge red brick cracker box. It was 4 stories high, 4 windows wide in front and back, and 10 windows wide at each side. All the apartments had 2 rooms, and they were all exactly alike except for the furniture. Terry lived with her mother and brother in the 3rd-floor front apartment that had side windows facing the woods. Her brother was just coming out of the front door when Terry reached it. He had already changed to play clothes and was munching on a peanut butter sandwich. His friend Danny was waiting out in front, and Danny's older brother Mike was crashing down the stairs with their 5-year-old brother Soupy, calling behind them, "Wait for me, wait for me." "Hey, what'd you get?" Tommy asked her. "I got all A's, except for art, and that doesn't count." Terry shrugged. She wasn't going to yell it out before the others. "What's the matter? You have a fight with somebody or something?" he asked, noticing how miserable she looked. She shook her head. Tommy said to the others, "You guys go over and start, and I'll be over in a couple of minutes." He followed Terry up the stairs. "Something's the matter," he said. "What happened?" When they were in the apartment, she threw down her books on the sofa and took the report card out of her pencil box and showed it to him. Her brother took a long look at the card, and then he looked again to make sure he wasn't seeing things. "Must be a mistake," he said. "It's always been your worst subject, but you never even got a D before, did you?" He looked at the year's line of marks. Nothing below a C minus. Got to be a mistake. "No, it isn't," Terry said. "She told me about it ahead of time, during a recess. She said I improved in everything else, but during arithmetic all I do lately is stare out the window." "And my arithmetic homework's gotten abdominal." "Gotten what?" Tommy yelled. "Abdominal. That means it's a mess." Tommy hooted. "You mean abominable. What do you use big words for if you can't say them right?" Terry flushed. If he knew what she meant, why did he have to make fun of her? "Say, what are you going to tell Mom about your report card?" Tommy asked. Terry shook her head. "I don't know. How mad do you think she'll be?" "Who knows? You want me to tell her? You can stay outside till it's over," he offered. "No, last time we did that, remember, she caught on and only got madder than ever." Terry threw her books in an angry heap behind the sofa. Tommy jumped as if he'd been hit. "What do you think you're doing with those books?" he yelled. "My gosh, the way you treat books, I'm surprised they let you take any out of the library." He reached back at the couch and picked up one of her books. "Look at this. Ink and pencil marks all over it, pages bent. When I got through with this, it was just as good as when I got it. Boy, I hate to see you get hold of my books." "What do you care? They aren't your books anymore, and I only do it with the crummy school books," Terry retorted. Tommy started for the door. "Just the same, no book should be treated that way." Before he went out, he added in a milder tone, "We'll be over in the woods playing hide and seek in case you want to come." Terry was left alone with her misery. She huddled in a lump on the sofa and thought about all the reasons she had to be sorry for herself. In the first place, she was always being scolded for something, practically every minute. She wondered if there had ever been a day when she hadn't been yelled at least 100 times. This year, since she had stopped playing with Cindy so much, it seemed that the scoldings had gotten worse. And then she had to be born a girl. That wasn't fair at all. Girls couldn't play football, couldn't have paper routes, they were supposed to stay clean all the time, and practically not even breathe, and certainly not have any fun. Her mother acted like she'd asked to be a girl. "Why can't you be a young lady?" her mother kept saying. But why should she? And she was stuck with being a girl the rest of her life. It just wasn't right. If there had to be girls, they should be treated like anybody else. To make life really impossible, she had to have a big brother. If it weren't for Tommy, maybe her mother wouldn't think she was such a mess. As it was, all she heard was, "Why can't you be neat like your brother? Why can't you do what you're told right away like your brother? How can you always lose things? Tommy never does. Tommy doesn't break everything he touches. Tommy this, Tommy that." There were probably worse big brothers. Kim's brother was always snitching on her or hitting her. But Terry almost wished her brother was like that. Every time she got to really being mad at him, he'd do something nice that made it impossible. Terry tried to make the tears come, but they wouldn't. They never did when she wanted them to. Not when she was alone and could cry in peace. No, she always had to burst out bawling when there were 10 million people around. She shoved the report card behind a sofa cushion so her mother wouldn't see it the first thing when she came in. There must be something she could do. If she did something ladylike, like homework, or like housework, maybe her mother wouldn't be so mad. What should she do? Dust? No, the last time she dusted, she'd knocked a picture off the wall. Her mother had been angry even though the glass hadn't broken. "How could you knock a picture off the wall dusting the dresser?" her mother yelled. It wouldn't have done any good if Terry had explained she was pretending the hand with the dust cloth was a plane, landing and taking off on the dresser top. Her mother didn't understand things like that. To a grown-up, it was wrong to try to get any fun out of housework. Well, she wouldn't dust, but there must be something. Yes, there was something much better. She could scrub the linoleum in the living room. Her mother might even notice that without being told. Terry got a rag and the soap and pail from the closet in Tommy's room and opened the doors to the kitchen part of the room. The water wasn't hot at this time of day, so she poured in a lot of soap. Floor scrubbing wasn't so bad, Terry thought, as she swished the rag around. She was on a beach, and the tide was coming in. When the water lapped up too close to her knees, she moved further up the beach. "Anchors aweigh, my boys, anchors aweigh," she sang out heartily. "Farewell to college joys, we sail at break of day." Pound, pound, pound came from the ceiling. "Blast that old Miss Jefferson," she muttered. She went on singing more quietly. It wasn't long before she was working on the last corner, and look how that floor shone. But, good heavens, She hadn't done that bit. And then she remembered. Her mother had waxed the floor Tuesday night. All Terry would have had to do to make it all shiny again was go over it with plain water. What she'd done was wash all the wax off. Terry pounded the rag on the floor. Blast, blast, blast. As soon as the floor dried, she'd have to wax it. Otherwise, her mother would notice the difference for sure, and she wouldn't appreciate it either. While she was waiting for the floor to dry, Terry read the instructions on the back of the wax can. Wash floor, it said. Well, that was done. Terry groaned aloud at the next words. Rinse thoroughly. The instructions said to be sure that every bit of soap was removed. Oh no, and all that soap she'd used. Terry rinsed the floor once and let it dry. There was still a film of soap on it. Twice more she rinsed it before all the soap was off. She wasn't on a beach anymore. Now she was in the middle of the ocean on a leaky raft. Her knees were sore and her back ached. And she was never, never, never going to grow up to be a lady and do housework all her life. When she had finished the last rinsing, she got up and hobbled to a chair by the table in the other room. She was so tired and so hot, except for her knees where her dress had gotten soaked and was clinging to her. Her school dress. She'd forgotten to change to her jeans. Her mother would be furious. As soon as the floor was dry, Terry changed clothes and buried her dress at the bottom of the dirty clothes pile. In a blazing temper, she unscrewed the top off the wax can and hurled the top at the floor. At the same moment, she dropped the can of wax. Wax oozed out. Oh, bilge, Terry shrieked. Well, she'd just have to start waxing from this part of the room. Her temper soon cooled under the rhythmic movement of her hand as she covered the floor with wax. And it did look nice. Wherever she touched the rag, the floor took on a new look, like King Midas turning things to gold. She was nearly done when Tommy walked in. Did you have to come in now? She yelled. Couldn't you have waited till it dried? Tommy gaped at her. What on earth are you doing? He asked. Well, what does it look like I'm doing? She snapped. He was about to say he thought she hated housework, but he thought better of it. Instead, he said reasonably, Look, how was I supposed to know? I only came in to get my paper bag, and to tell you that you could tell Mom it's my fault about the F, on account of my paper route and our not doing our homework together anymore to save me time. Oh, Terry said, that's an idea. She didn't point out that doing their homework together had hurt her as much as helped. After Tommy checked her homework, he showed her his. He always made his seem like fun. She knew hers wasn't, so she ended up knowing more about decimals than fractions. Say, what are you going to do? He asked. About footprints, he added, as she looked at him blankly. Terry looked around her. She had waxed herself into a corner. That figured. It just figured. At least Tommy didn't laugh, although he looked like he wanted to. I'll try not to make any more prints than I can help, he said. He took a flying leap to the doorway of his room, and just 2 leaps on the way out. See you later, he called. Terry looked around for a place to get off the floor. The only thing near enough was the radiator. That would have to do. Sitting on the radiator, she finished the last bit of waxing by shoving the rag around with her foot. She looked again at the wax can. Allow 20 minutes for drying, it said on the back. Before 1 minute was up, Terry was squirming. What an uncomfortable place a radiator was. At the end of 2 minutes, she couldn't stand it anymore. She'd just have to re-wax her footprints as well as Tommy's. She walked over to the sofa and tried to think of something to do while she was waiting. Tommy's books must be behind the sofa, too. Yes, there was Tales of Today and Yesterday. She'd already read that when he was out on his paper route, and he'd never found out. Well, she'd see how many words she knew from next year's speller. By the time the floor was dry, she decided that next year's spelling would be as easy as ever. Very often she was the last one up in a spelling bee. It was because she read so much, she guessed. Terry touched up the footprints and stood in the doorway to admire her work. She didn't think her mother could have done any better. Now, if she could only think of some nice way to break the news of her report card to her mother. When Mrs. Seth came home, Terry was asleep on the sofa. She jumped up as her mother came in. "How can you sleep on a day like this?" her mother wondered. "The sun is shining, and it's your first half day of vacation." Terry yawned. "Oh, cookies," she said, seeing the bag in her mother's arm. "I forgot it was payday." Her mother worked in a cookie factory. For 25 cents, she could buy a huge bag of cookies that were broken or for some other reason weren't just right. Once a month, she brought home cookies, and on the other payday, they had ice cream. "Not till after supper," her mother warned. "Okay," Terry said meekly. Her mother looked at her sharply. "Teresa Seth, what have you got all over you? Look at your hands. And on your face and clothes, too. Honestly, you're more of a boy than your brother." Terry looked at the dried wax on her hands. She couldn't think of anything to say. After all her work, all she got for it was a scolding. She had all she could do to keep from blubbering. "You go take a shower," her mother said, "while I cook supper, and get into your other jeans and shirt." Terry put on her rubber slippers, grabbed her clothes and a towel and soap. She stamped down the hall to the shower room, shared by all the families on the third floor. She was so discouraged that she didn't even yell when she stubbed her toe coming out of the shower, nor did she take any pleasure in the squish, squish, squish of her rubber slippers as she went back to her apartment. Her mother smiled at her as she came in. "There, doesn't that feel better?" she asked. "Supper's ready now. You can whistle Tommy in." Terry took the whistle from its nail by the window and tooted twice. Each family had its own signal for whistling the children in. Still, Terry didn't know how she was going to tell her mother about her report card. Should she do it now while her mother seemed to be in a good mood? But she couldn't bring herself to do it. And yet she knew she should bring it up before her mother remembered the report cards herself. Supper was a quiet meal. Terry had nothing to say. Her mother kept staring at her, and Tommy uneasily watched them both. After supper, Terry stacked the dishes. As her mother was washing them, she said, with her back to Terry, "Are you out of sorts because I scolded you?" "No," Terry mumbled. And then when her mother looked at her, "Well, I guess I was pretty dirty." They both smiled at the same moment, and Terry knew she would never have a better time to tell her mother. Yet she didn't want to break the spell. After all her hours of worry, it was like the sun coming out after a rain, and she didn't want to make the sun go back behind a cloud. She hesitated, and the moment passed. "You don't have to dry dishes tonight," her mother said. "The last day of school should be a special day. Just take the garbage down the hall, and then you can go out and play." It was a special day, all right, Terry thought grimly, as she took the bag of garbage and went down the hall toward the garbage room. Oh, she could kick herself for not saying something when she had the chance. She was so angry that she opened the door, shut her eyes, and hurled the bag as hard as she could toward the ceiling, even though she knew she'd have to pick it up to put it in one of the cans. The bag hit the ceiling with a thud, and Terry opened her eyes and looked straight into the eyes of Mr. Bayard, who lived in the apartment next door to the garbage room. It was too much. Mr. Bayard began to laugh, and Terry burst into tears and fled. Mr. Bayard called after her, Don't cry, Terry. It's all right. What on earth? Said her mother. Terry went straight to the sofa and dug out her report card. The tears still streaming down her face, she handed the card to her mother, who had followed her into the living room. Her mother read the card and then looked at her daughter, while Terry fought down her sobs. There was a short silence, with Terry and Tommy hardly breathing. Then her mother said, "Well, at last. I was beginning to think my children weren't normal. Finally, one of you got an F." Tommy laughed. "That's what the F's for. Finally." But their mother was staring at the floor. "Good heavens," she said. "I can't believe it." "Terry waxed it," Tommy said helpfully. Terry wished he'd kept his big mouth shut. Now her mother would say, "But what on earth for? I just waxed it." But instead her mother looked again at the report card and back at the floor. And Terry knew her mother understood exactly why she'd waxed the floor. "You did a beautiful job," her mother said gently. "Thank you." "That's all right," Terry said. She didn't know what else to say. She would have hugged her mother if they had been the hugging kind. Instead, she made a resolution to help her mother more often, only next time she was going to think what she was doing first. Her mother started back to the kitchen. "I don't know why I brought these cookies home. Nobody seems to want them," she said. Terry and her brother ran for the cookie bag. "First dibs on a chocolate graham," Terry yelled. "Kinder's Veepers," Tommy said firmly. Over the clinking of the dishes in the sink, Terry heard her mother saying, "Now, if I could work out a deal with her teacher, maybe I wouldn't have to do any housework at all next year." Terry and Tommy decided it was time they went outside before the streetlights came on and they had to come in again. There was a whole summer before them, Terry thought happily, a summer full of fun and excitement before school began again. That is the end of our chapter. I'll be back with you again tonight with chapter 2.